So this is the floor installed at the back, and just helping me to get a line of what I had to rebuild there. And I ended up rebuilding a lot of this. I also ended up covering some of it up. I'll show you in another picture. But I'm not really opposed to that, and I'll explain why. This is the front. So this is all pretty much sewn back up. Here's a piece of the original floor that I showed in the earlier picture that was all ragged and everything. I set the new floor in, which is this big black panel. It goes from here all the way to the back of the car. I set that in, marked this floor, and determined where I needed to cut. I maybe gave it about an inch overlap. And but from underneath, you have a nice clean edge there. It's not all nasty looking. Same with the area around these floor pan extensions, front floor pan extensions. This piece, this is the seat platform, and it's a pretty important piece structurally. You can tell just by holding it. It's much heavier gauge than everything else, and it connects from this rocker panel to this rocker panel. So I think it's fairly important. I removed mine and cleaned it up, and it just sat in the garage until it was ready or time to use it, and then I put it in, and it worked out just fine. This is the back. What's underneath the back seat. I got rid of a bunch of the crap that was under there. When you look underneath the car, you don't see any mess anymore. And the only place you actually see any mess, I left some of the junk in here and in here. These two holes are to access the shocks. You can't see down in there, but down in here is the nut, and the actual shock comes up in there, and that whole piece is the part that supports the upper part of the shock. So you have to, whether it's the 66 Mustang or my version of it, you have to take the back seat, the upper part of the back seat off in order to get at your shocks. And that's still the case here. Inside, you see a little bit of mess. To me, it's more like a little time capsule of what the car once looked like. I'm perfectly fine with it being there. You don't see it from anywhere else, except if you take the seat out. And even then, I don't find it objectionable. So I didn't go through the painstaking process of removing everything. I ended up covering some of it up, and I'm just fine with that. This is the repair I did to the wheel well. This is the driver's side wheel well, where I cut out the top and then welded in the new pieces. There's a little step up right here that's kind of hard to see the depth of it, but it basically matches the stamped version of the convertible wheel well. It's actually cleaner. The stamped version has the seam all squished over, and it looks like they took a regular one and put it in a machine and just smushed it to make it work. So mine's a little cleaner than that. It all gets covered. You never see this again. It gets covered with the convertible well liner that goes in here. But it's clean anyway. So this is right around 2007, the beginning of 2007. And being on my back got really old. I decided to lift the car up. I'm a carpenter, so I built something out of wood to get the car off the ground. It didn't take very long for that to get old. And within a few days of building that, I built a rotisserie for the car. And again, this is January 2007. The rotisserie's a huge help. I have just a regular garage on my house. There's nothing special about it. It's a normal depth. In fact, it might even be shallower than a normal depth. It's only like 19 feet deep or something. But I needed a better way to work on the car. So I built this brace. It bolts on the front where the front bumper braces mount to the front frame rail extensions. I just made it where it bolted on there, and then there was a bolt in the middle of it that attached it to this header that was in these uprights, and there's a one pin on each end. It's a bolt. And I did something similar on the back. So I could go to each corner, lift it up, slide that pin in, go to the next corner, lift it up about 6 inches, slide the pin in, kept doing that until I worked the car up to a reasonable height to where I could actually spin it and get to it like this. So this is the car up on its side. It's very easy to move. I would just literally lift it up and set it like that and just kind of hold it in place and then go to the front and tighten down the bolt, and go to the back and tighten down the bolt, and it would just stay there. And as you can imagine, it makes welding on the bottom of the car just hugely helpful. It sucks to weld on your back, over your head or face. One, it burns the crap out of you. And two, your welds just aren't as good. You got gravity working against you, and it's just not nearly as good of a deal. You get it up on its side and you can really get right in there and work on it. And, it's very obvious to see how much easier it is. This X brace I built, there's a piece of 1.5 inch tube here and here. That's pretty heavy wall. And it's welded to the front frame rail extension and the rear frame rail extension, or rear torque box. I'm not sure which one it is. And then the X itself is bolted, 2 bolts here, 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 and here, so it can be removed. The thought is you would remove it to get at the drive shaft or exhaust or whatever. Now, in the end, it conflicted with my exhaust, and there was just no way around it. So if I had lowered the exhaust to go under it, my exhaust would just be too low. And I thought I would rebuild the cross brace to work around the exhaust. I haven't done that yet. I might do it because I'm stuck at home right now because of COVID-19. But anyway, we'll see. But so I had to scrap it. But at least this piece and this piece are still there. They're welded into the car, and they tie the front and the back of the car together in a really good way and give me the foundation to add some sort of cross bracing in the future if I want. But nevertheless, this was about the rotisserie more than anything else. And the rotisserie makes quick work of everything else, just having the ability to turn the car up like this or upside down or however you want. That silver stuff, that master coat stuff that I used in the rocker panels, I also used in a bunch of these areas just to seal it up before priming it. And this was all before seam sealing and everything else that I did, but this is just the prime coat on the car. And kind of gave me the ability to put the car back upright and work on some other stuff. I mean, not upright, but on its side, work on some other stuff. So the next thing was the cowl. We're looking down sort of from the top of the car. This is the top of the dash. The speaker would normally be right here. This is the engine bay. The firewall is right here. And the cowl is that big vented thing where it doesn't suck in air, but air can come in. And there's 2 round vents on either side underneath the dash that one is used for just fresh air and the other is used to bring in air for the heater in the original Mustang. Mine was an absolute mess, so I had to redo it. I think when this car was originally built, I think when all of them were originally built, there wasn't really much in the way of paint inside the cowl except what was oversprayed in there. And over time, leaves would get in there and they'd clog up the drain and the whole thing would just rot. And it's very common to see those cowl vents just completely rotted underneath the dash. And that was certainly the case with mine. So I had to remove it, which meant taking out a bazillion spot welds. That's what these are. There are spot welds all around the perimeter of that thing. So you use a spot weld cutter to cut those out. And that worked pretty well. I had no idea what a spot weld cutter was until I started trying to cut them out. And it was very hard. And it was doing more harm than good. And then I did a little research and found out you can buy spot weld cutters. Eastwood sells a great one. And I bought a little set, and that's what I used. I burned through a few of them, but I had like 100 of these to do, and not just on the cowl. I had them in other areas, so it worked out well. So this is after I've removed the bulk of it. like torn the bulk of it out, and I still have some spot welds to deal with because initially I was just peeling the metal out around the spot welds, and it was pretty messy. But in the end, I got it all out, and it pretty obvious where I needed to replace stuff. Like here, it was just metal that was gone, and I ended up fixing all that. I bought a new two-piece cowl from CJ Pony Parts. Most of my parts came from CJ Pony Parts. I highly recommend them. I bought some stuff from Laurel Mountain Mustang and Mustang Unlimited and Kentucky Mustang. So I bought stuff from other places, but most of the stuff came from CJ Pony Parts. I just happened to hook up with them early on in the project, and um, their prices were usually the same or better than everybody else's. So, um, like everything else, that's where this cowl came from. It does not come red. It comes with an epoxy primer on it. I wanted to test my paint color. I had been keeping my eyes peeled for a good color, just any car on the road that I knew it was going to be a red. I wanted a particular red, and then one day I saw a Lexus. It was a new car with a new red color on it, and as it turns out, that's a Toyota color called Red Salsa, which is this color, and I liked it a lot. It's a huge difference between in the light and in the darkness. It's really nice when the sun hits it. You'll see better pictures of it later, but I wanted to paint the inside of the cowl with my finished color. And so this is a good opportunity to paint the cowl and to test the red color. And I seam sealed around these vents and painted the whole thing. It got base and clear on it. I think I might have used a single stage on this. I don't think so. No, I didn't. I used base and clear on it. So the exact same thing I ultimately used on the car. This is now looking at the top of the cowl and the bottom of the cowl. So these are the two outside pieces of the cowl as opposed to what was inside before. So if you lean up under the dash, this is what you're going to see. I painted all that at the same time. I did not paint this because it was going to get painted with the rest of the car, so it didn't need it. I punched a ton of holes all the way around the perimeter of this thing, and didn't really punch holes, but started holes with a drill all the way around this. Like I put the two pieces together and I drilled in there a little bit just to get rid of the paint to give me a good contact surface for the plug weld. And then I ran a wire from vent to vent inside the cowl. And this was so that later, after the cowl was installed, like assembled, welded, installed, I would pull a bed sheet in there, and that would protect the inside of the cowl from any overspray or any junk that went in the vents. Initially, I just covered the vents with tape, but ultimately, I pulled that bed sheet in there, and it did perfectly. When I painted the car, the bed sheet got overspray all over it, but nothing else did. So it worked great. And just for reference, now we're in May of 2009. So, it's been, I think, a couple years since the rotisserie was built or the last date that I had on a picture. And not a ton of work has been done since then, but, kind of slowly moving along. So now I'm ready to weld the two pieces together. And to do that, I did plug welds, which I didn't know what they were at the time. I would have called it a spot weld, but it's actually called a plug weld. These are plug weld pliers. I got them from, I think it's Matco or Masco, the tool company. They're kind of like Snap-on. And I looked them up online, and I finally found them. And as it turns out, my local guy had them. So I went and found him and bought them. This is built on like a vice grip type of frame. And the lower pad that you can't see is solid copper. The upper pad is forked like this. So what it does is it pinches down the two pieces of metal you're trying to weld together and gives you the perfect little place to do your weld. So you you just go one at a time. I welded like a few spots, and then I just went and filled them all in. And after that's done, it looks like this. You have all these plug welds around the perimeter of the thing. I think this is actually the no, this is the top side of the plug weld, and they look pretty good. When you grind them down, you find that they're not as thorough as you thought. Like this weld ends up looking like that. So, just as a matter of exercise, even though this is plenty strong, it's probably just as strong, if not stronger, than the original spot weld that was in there. I wanted to clean them up just for the fun of it. So, I went and welded them again. So, this picture is those same two locations cleaned up. And so, your plug weld can be completely, 100% thorough and undetectable when you're finished with it. And it's kind of fun to do them that well. So after that thing is all assembled, I prepped the opening. You can see here where I replaced a bunch of metal, cleaned it all up, got everything ground, prepped it with that same material that I mentioned earlier. Also prepped the back side of the dash. I primed it because it's impossible to get to later on. Then this is the cowl ready to go in. I punched a bunch of holes all the way around it again. And the area that's silver here is that same material. I put that in the joint where the two mate, the mating surfaces, and just welded through it. And it worked out just fine. So I don't have a picture of it, but I just put it in the car and welded it, and everything was great. So then I moved on to the bottom of the final finish on the bottom. I had a couple things to repair, a couple things to clean up, and I did that and got it all prepped, and then primed it with maybe a 2K or epoxy primer or something. I can't remember what I used. At this point, it had all been seam sealed and ready to go. And then the finish coat. So now we're in September of 2009. This is a gloss finish. I wanted something that stuff would probably not stick to. My car is not a show car. I don't like park it places and put mirrors under it so people can see it. But I did want something that was nice and clean under there, and it just looked new as it is, and it came out great. So then the next thing to move on to was after I painted the bottom, I got rid of the rotisserie and set the car back on jack stands. And at this point, I had decided I wasn't going to use that 302 that I had, and I had picked out a new motor. And just about any motor I was going to put in this car was not going to fit in the car with the shock towers. These things take up a ton of room. They're necessary for the type of front suspension that was used in '66, but I was replacing all my front suspension with the Heights Mustang II front suspension, and that would mean eliminating the shock towers, which is what I did. I rough cut them out and cleaned up all this superfluous junk that was on the front frame rail extension. Did it on both sides, and then the next thing I did was I took a piece of sheet metal and I cut it the shape of the replacement panel that I wanted, and I took that panel to a HVAC shop, and the guy let me use his beading machine to put beads in it like this, and then I laid that panel over and traced onto the outside of the engine compartment. I traced a line, cut that line, and then welded that whole thing in. So it's a butt joint all the way around there, which is a real pain in the ass with thin metal, but it can be done. It just got to be patient, do a ton of little tacks. And in the end, I got it all welded up. Then I used a Kevlar reinforced putty, sort of like Bondo, with Kevlar fiber in it, and put that on there and got it all finished. And in the end, it looks like this, which to me, it looks like it came from the factory that way. I was really happy with the finished look of it. Not that you really see it. Once you put the engine in there, you don't really appreciate the metamorphosis that it went through. And on this side, there's a fender and a tire. You don't see it at all. It's completely hidden. But I know it's there, and I was really pleased with the way it came out, especially when you consider it to this, which is, again, what it looked like before I started. So a huge difference, but it created this massive engine bay, which, as it turns out, was only marginally large enough for the engine I put in the car. The next step in the process is putting front suspension in the car, because I don't have anything in there now. So following the Heights process, their system, first thing you do is you have to very carefully mark these center lines, and it's all relative to a known fixed position at the front of the frame rail. So I got those marked this area and then cut it out and cleaned up all the paint and whatnot that was on this frame rail extension so that it was ready to receive the next piece, which is this, which comes in the kit, and tacked it in and then fully welded it and cleaned it up. And, in the end, it looked like that. Now it's ready for the cross member. The cross member comes ready to go in. It literally just slipped right in. If you do everything else right, and if your frame rails are in the right position anyway, like if the car hasn't been wrecked or something, those will slip right in, and mine did. You put them in, you center them on this and weld them in. Weld on both sides. And then the next part is the shock and the coil support, the upper support. It gets welded in on top of all this. Same with the passenger side. And in the end, it looks like that. And now we're to June 2010. So, 10 years ago from now is when I was building the front suspension. At this point, I had purchased my engine. In fact, I purchased it quite some time before, or not quite some time, but I purchased it sometime before. And it was time to start fitting that in. You're putting an engine that doesn't belong in the car into a car that isn't set up to receive any engine at all. There's no motor mounts, no nothing. So you get to sort of decide a combination of what works well, what looks good, what makes sense. Like I guess there's a bunch of factors in determining where your engine goes. For me, it came down to one thing. I'll show you in a second, which is probably not what it should come down to. But this is my motor. So this is a 99. It's from a 99 Mustang Cobra SVT. So it's the 4.6 32 valve motor. It's an aluminum block. From the factory, this thing was 317 or 320 horsepower. That's what it was rated as. It had some intake problems, and a lot of the intakes were fixed in order to correct the flow issues. But still, it had problems. I sent my intake off, and I had it ported, which fixed that problem. These engines also had a kind of a systemic problem with the cooling system, where there was a dead end back here on the back of this head. And as a result, this last cylinder and the second last cylinder would often overheat and cause problems. So I took a freeze plug out of the back of this head and put a fitting in there and tied my cooling system into, or tied that head into the coolant system using this crossover delete from On3 Performance, which I think we'll see later in pictures. And I think I have some video of it too. So what determined where to put my engine? It came down to this. With the Tremec T45, which came from the same donor car mounted on the engine, and putting the shifter of that motor in the hole where the shifter for the 66 Mustang went, the engine to me seemed to be in a perfect location. The only modification I made is I cut this little tiny piece out so that that adjuster nut could come up through there without interfering with anything. So I set the engine there. That was my starting place for the engine, which it turns out ended up being the permanent location. So now it's a matter of setting the rake of the engine or the levelness of the engine relative to the rest of the car. So I would use blocks on the crossmember to raise it and lower it and get it to where it seemed to be right. I set the frame of the car level and just figured, maybe having the engine level relative to the frame makes as much sense as anything else. There's probably some engineer out there that's saying, no, it needs to have a 2-degree slope or some shit like that. And in the end, mine had some slope, but it was driven by something other than the fact that I knew it had to have a slope. So the next several pictures is just kind of looking at clearance issues and, where the engine was ultimately going to rest. This is the clearance between the factory intake manifold and the the coil spring support up here. Not much at all in the way of space in there. And I'll show you a little more of that because I changed to headers and I had to really hunt for headers that would fit in there. These are just more clearance pictures. More pictures, of where I blocked it up. I did that a few times with different size blocks before I finally became happy with where it was. And in this process, I took the engine in and out of the car several times. Some days, 2 times a day, taking the engine in and out of the car. Just test fitting stuff, take it out, move something, do it again. One thing I determined is that my crossmember was going to be in the way of the oil pan. So I marked it to modify it and cut out a section of it. And then I boxed in these ends and closed it back up. And it helped facilitate pulling that engine up and out. In the absence of that, I'm not sure I could actually clear it. But this made it work fine, and I don't think that I compromised the structural integrity of the crossmember, beyond what it needed to be. So it's perfectly fine. So the next step was the motor mounts. And this is me building the motor mounts. This piece of metal right here with the 3 holes in it, that came from the 1999 Mustang crossmember. When I bought the engine and transmission from the donor car, it was still sitting on the crossmember. Like they just cut it out of the car with with a Sawzall. And the crossmember just meant that the engine didn't sit on a concrete floor. It would sit on the crossmember. So I cut out this piece right here, this rectangle of metal, and I bolted it to the motor mount. This is the motor mount attached to the motor with the rubber, flexible section in it and everything. So I stuck it on there and put the nut on there, got it seated up so that this was nice and tight. And then I did that on both sides, taking a bunch of measurements to make sure I had the engine centered. And, I wanted it, everything I made for the left, I wanted a mirror version for the right. And if I mirrored those things, I know that it was all working out as far as centering it. So I made this out of cardboard, all these pieces, taped it all together, kept trimming and cutting till I got it perfect. And then I took that same thing and took it apart and put it back together in the mirror version of it, checked it on the other side, and it worked perfectly also. This meant adjusting a little bit, moving the engine back and forth from time to time until I got it to where it really was working properly on both sides. Once I had that sorted out, I traced everything onto 3/16 plate steel and cut out the pieces, held it in place with magnets, and just tacked it all together. And in the end, I ended up with this on both sides, and then I took that off, brought it over to the bench, and closed up one side of it, and it looked like that when it was installed. So there the two motor mounts are. The closed up part is facing towards the back of the car. In the end, I ended up modifying this one a little bit because my steering rack came right up through here. So I had to cut out a little piece on the back to accommodate that, but it worked out just fine.